My name is Janet E. Helms, PhD. I am a professor emeritus at Boston College, not in residence. My field is counseling psychology, and my area of interest is race and racism. So I would describe myself as an evolving racial justice psychologist. And what that means to me is that I try to take the fictitious labels that we use for people, the fictitious racial labels that we use for people, and help us to see how they matter so much in our lives, even though they aren't real psychological constructs. My domain is just about anything that happens in society because race and racism are present in society. But specifically, maybe the work that I am most known for is racial identity and psychological assessment. Racial identity is big because, in effect, people have often thought about internalized racism and how that affects people of color. And that's actually how I began to study racial identity, thinking about, studying about, researching about how racial identity impacted people of color, especially Black people. If you were a person of color, you internalize racism. And in this society, that means you're taught to feel that you are inferior to other people. What I developed were models to help people to recognize when they had internalized that socialization and then to learn how to undo it because it was limiting their opportunities in the world. But what people did not realize is that white people also internalize racism. And the racism that they internalize leads them to believe that they were superior to people of color, especially Black people. And because they feel like they are inferior when Black people or other people of color accomplish something that they're not supposed to because they're supposed to be inferior, then that makes white people afraid. So what I want to do and what I've worked to do is to do research and theory that helps white people recognize the extent to which they are falsely believing that they are superior, and that belief leads them to be afraid of other people, to not interact with other people in ways that are meaningful. I also have worked on bias and testing. Actually, I call it fairness because fairness means that, in effect, when you use tests, the test ought to not be related to racial constructs. The test ought not to be related to environmental factors, and if they are, then you need to correct the test. You don't need to correct the people. One of the things that happens with standardized testing is that we compare mean scores of groups and assume that that means that people of color are inferior to white people. We don't recognize the extent to which race, socialization affects the test scores not only of people of color but also of white people, because the test constructors actually develop tests to measure the skills of white people. They don't develop tests to measure the skills of people of color. So that's been a lifelong interest of mine, and I write about that quite a bit. The third area that I should at least briefly mention is social interaction theory. That is a theory in which I talk about the power dynamics of race and racism and the extent to which when interactions between people of different races or people of the same race who have developed different racial identity strategies, when those interactions go awry, how do you figure out what went wrong? What I do is to teach people to recognize the different ways that they can go wrong and then to use strategies to try to correct the situation so that it doesn't happen again. So if I were to summarize what I do, I would say that race and racism are in the background of just about everything that we do in society. What I try to do is to bring race and racism into the foreground and to give people a language for talking about it, for recognizing it, and for dealing with it in better ways than we've done heretofore. There are lots of places where my attention is needed, I think. And so some people would say I'm scattered. I would say there's always that underlying theme of If we want to be a racially just society, then we have to recognize the ways in which we are racially unjust.